everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing the anatomy of the female reproductive system. I already made one video of the male reproductive system, so I guess you can watch them in either order. It doesn't really matter, just make sure you watch both of them. So I only have one model today. This is the female reproductive system model, and as you can see, it's the same as the last one in that you can kind of open it up to reveal the sagittal section, or you can look at it in a three-dimensional cross section. And I'm going to start pretty much in the primary organs of the female reproductive system, which would be the ovaries. That's where the eggs are made and where oogenesis goes on. And if you look sort of on top here in the back, you can see the ovaries are out here. In a three-dimensional model, here's the front, here's the inferior side. This is the rectum at the back, the sigmoid colon, and I guess the rectum would be down further. You can see that the uterus sits in the middle. It actually sits on top of the bladder, and out on either side inside the pelvis are the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes that sort of come up and stick onto the ovary. So you can see that right back here. Here's the ovary. That's where the eggs are stored from before birth until menstruation begins. At menstruation, one side or the other will go through ovulation and spit out an egg into the general direction of the uterine tube. Now, unlike the male reproductive system, this is not a closed system. The uterine tube is not actually completely connected to the ovary. There's little structures that hang down here that are called fimbriae, and they kind of move like in this kind of a motion, and they create sort of waves that suck the egg in towards the uterine tube. So the egg could potentially float away, but most of the time it gets itself into the tube. It travels down the tube. If fertilization were to happen, it would happen about here in the uterine tube. The tube leads into the uterus. You can see here's a quarter view of the uterus. When the uterus does not have a developing baby in it, it's usually quite flattened. We call it a potential space, but it's actually quite small and flat inside. So this is the uterus, and you can see it really is sitting right on top of the urinary bladder. If fertilization were to happen in the uterine tube, the egg would continue down that uterine tube, come into the uterus, and hopefully implant inside on the endometrium of the uterus. Guarding the opening to the uterus is the cervix. So the cervix is right here. And the tube leading from the cervix to outside of the body, this long muscular tube, is the vagina. That is the copulatory organ of the female. When the copulatory organ of the male, the penis, enters the vagina, hopefully, if you want conception to occur, the ejaculation will happen up here, very close to the cervix, and that helps to reduce the amount of time the sperm has to spend in this very acidic environment of the vagina, and the sperm can come up into the uterus, pick a tube, go down that tube, and hopefully find an egg in just the right place. So, unlike the male system, the urinary system and the reproductive system of the female are completely different and separate. You can see the urethra right here has nothing at all to do with the vagina. The bladder will empty into the urethra, and that will empty when urination happens, and sexual intercourse happens here in the vagina, and fertilization of the egg will happen if the semen that is deposited here contains sperm that have enough energy to get through the uterus and pick the right tube and fertilize the egg in the uterine tube. The opening of the vagina is at the bottom. I'm going to actually put this back together for just a second. If you looked at it from the outside, you could actually see that this right here would be the opening to the vagina. The opening to the urethra is a little bit further up. It's there. So it's two separate holes. You can see there's two sets of lips here, inner and outer. The inner lips are called the labia minora, and these are not covered with hair. They're usually darker, and there's a very, very high blood supply. The labia minora become engorged with blood in a manner similar to the corpus spongiosum in the male. If you remember back, the male system had corpus spongiosum. Here's the male system, which surround the urethra. When an erection happens, the corpus spongiosum fills with blood and gets engorged. But instead of squeezing that tube down, the urethra, it actually expands out. Same thing happens with the labia minora. During sexual arousal, the labia minora will fill with blood and become larger and more sensitive. The outer lips are called the labia majora, and these do have hair on them. So you can see here would be the labia minora, and here would be the labia majora. And this is homologous to the skin that covers the testes, the scrotum, in the male. In the female, there's one other structure we need to discuss, and that's this sort of blue colored one right here. That's the clitoris. The clitoris is made out of the same type of erectile tissue that we saw in the male for the erectile tissue, the corpus spongiosum. So during sexual arousal, the clitoris becomes engorged with blood and becomes very sensitive to touch. Looking back at the male system, this column, there were two different columns, remember, at the top here on the dorsal side of the penis, and upon sexual arousal they would fill with blood and stiffen and cause the penis to become erect. So that's actually the same tissue that you find in the clitoris, and just like in the male, stimulation of that tissue causes orgasm. On the posterior side, you can see here is the rectum and the anal canal and the anus of the female. So there's 1, 2, 3 different holes here. That's it for the female reproductive system. See you in class.